Putin hates Western liberal market democracy. He hates the way we work, the way we're governed. He wants to destroy that. He's at war with us. He's made it clear that he's at war with us. That's been the messaging from him and Russian state TV. So, we need to make sure that Russia cannot regenerate its military machine that's been destroyed in Ukraine. And so sanctions have to remain for a long time, a bit like North Korea. We need to weaken him longer term. So we need to be cleverer, more aggressive. We could do more within the existing sanctions regime. There is also a really interesting idea that's been put around by someone called Nigel Davis of a think tank, former ambassador to Belarus. He argues that, in the end, we need to send a really clear signal to Western business that you shouldn't really be doing any business with Russia, right? And he argues, and I actually agree with him, that we should set a date at some point in the future, maybe 3 or 5 years away, and we say Western business should move to zero trade with Russia. The default setting should be we shouldn't trade at all with Russia, aside from getting special licenses for things that are really critical, right?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the war in Ukraine, and in particular, the economic implications for Russia, for Ukraine, and for the rest of the world. And I'm delighted to be joined by the economist Timothy Ash, an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Timothy Ash, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
My pleasure.
I wanted to start just by talking about the current economic situation in Russia. On the one hand, we hear about the Western sanctions imposed on the country. On the other, we hear about Russia being on a war footing in terms of its economy. So, as an overview, how would you sum up the state of Russia's economy at the moment?
Yeah, well, the first thing to note is that, Putin, the one person who knew this war was going to happen was Putin, right? So he's been preparing it for a very long time. I would say perhaps a decade. You can go back to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 when the West first imposed sanctions. He knew he was going to invade, right? And he built up Russia's reserves, I should say. He deleveraged the economy, made it less vulnerable to Western sanctions. Foreign exchange reserves at the onset of the war were about $640 billion. That's over 500 billion pounds, right? So he had all these reserves. So when he invaded, and he knew sanctions were going to come, there was a lot of durability there already, right? And obviously, initially he benefited from high energy and oil prices because also he created that, if you remember, just before the invasion, there was a lot of pressure on energy markets. People were worried about impact on energy supplies to Europe. So oil and energy prices increased. He benefited from that as well. It meant more revenues came in, so that helped him. So there's a lot of durability. Aggressive sanctions were imposed. Some of those resources have been eroded. Around $330 billion of that $640 billion I mentioned of foreign exchange reserves were immobilized in Western jurisdictions, so he's kind of halved his availability of foreign currency reserves. And its sanctions have begun to bite. They've reduced those buffers, made Putin make difficult choices. Increased defense spending means less resources for elsewhere in the economy, less social spending, less spending on the economy. Russia's been converted to a war economy, right? And that, difficult choices have been made. Growth has been lower overall. I think actually not just since the invasion, but again, if you think of the last decade, the sanctions and the policies that Russia has put in place to alleviate the impact of sanctions have meant that Russia has grown a lot weaker, a lower pace of growth than would otherwise have been the case. Inflation's been higher. So there's been some pain, but the economy hasn't crashed. And it hasn't crashed because he had those buffers in place. And I think in the end, sanctions have been too weak, right? I mean, that's the reality. And I think the reason they're too weak is because in the end, I think for sanctions to work, the countries imposing them have to be willing to bear some cost. And actually what's happened is with all these sanctions packages, it's been the sanctions by the highest common denominator. So basically, some country within the Western alliance has always got an excuse of why their industry, their banking sector, their companies are going to get hurt, so let's not do them. So we've had lots of excuses and reasons to weaken and moderate the sanctions. And I think in the end, it shows that Western countries haven't really taken the threat from Putin seriously. If we saw this as a really big threat, a threat to our national security, we would do whatever it takes to beat Putin and beat Russia. And if we're unwilling to shoulder the burden, take some of the cost, it kind of shows really an unwillingness to take the whole thing seriously. If you think about it, a different way to look is the Western alliance has a combined gross domestic product of about $40 trillion. Russia's economy is 1.8 trillion. So we're 20 times the size of Russia. If we wanted to cripple Putin's economy, we could easily, but we haven't really been willing to do whatever it takes. And I think, you could say that's about the economy, you could say about defense spending, lots of different areas. In the end, for far too long, we have just not taken the threat from Putin seriously, which is one reason why he was able to get away with invading Ukraine in the first place.
Well, let's unpick what the West could do more of in terms of sanctions. One of the ideas you've heard suggested in recent months, I think the former UK Foreign Secretary William Hague suggested this, that seized Russian assets that are currently frozen should be used and the funds from them should be directed towards military aid for Ukraine. Is that feasible?
Absolutely. As I mentioned before, $330 billion of Russian government cash is in our banking systems in London, in Belgium, in the US. We have this money sitting on our bank accounts. Now, to fund the war in Ukraine at the moment, to fund the arms purchases, to keep the Ukrainian budget working, costs about $100 billion a year, $100 billion. And at the moment, Western taxpayers are paying that. We are paying for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Putin invades Ukraine, destroys their infrastructure, bridges, power stations, roads, railway stations, and we are helping rebuild it. But our taxpayer money has been paid to do it, while we have $330 billion of Putin's cash sitting in our bank accounts. It's insane, actually, that we're not using that money. Now, there's lots of excuses being used as why we shouldn't. They're all pretty weak. One of them is this idea that in doing it, we undermine Western rule of law and confidence in our banking and financial system. Other authoritarian regimes will be less willing to put their money in our banking systems because they're worried that the same thing will happen to them. Well, actually, we've already made clear that Putin is not going to get the money back. The assets have already been immobilized, put beyond Russia's use. The message to other authoritarian regimes has been pretty clear. Right? Your asset, if you decide to invade another country, commit war crimes and genocide, your assets are at risk. Well, don't do those kind of things. If those regimes don't do those kind of things, their assets are safe in our jurisdiction. So, and actually, since we immobilized the assets, assets have not been pulled out of our banking and financial system by Saudi Arabia, by China, by these other regimes that, might think about pulling their assets. So there's been no evidence at all about a threat to the dollar, threat to sterling, threat to the euro. The other argument is that we worry about retaliation. So there are Western assets in Russia, and Putin is already seizing them. But these companies, they made their own decisions. Western beer companies or energy companies, they made their own decision to invest in Russia. These were bad investment decisions, essentially. And we shouldn't be bailing them out by not going after immobilized, frozen Russian assets, right? We shouldn't be our taxpayers should not be writing checks to bail out greedy Western companies that made bad investment calls in Russia. That's the core of the decision. And actually, from a legal point of view, there are solutions why we can do it in a legal way. In the end, it requires political will. Laws are made by politicians, legislate. In the US, it's possible. There is something called an executive order. So basically, Joe Biden can get up in the morning and sign a piece of paper and the whatever $30 billion of Russian assets in US jurisdiction can be signed over to Ukraine. In the UK, we've got about 25 billion pounds of assets. Parliament can legislate, it can sign laws or make laws to make it happen. It can be done. It requires political will. And unfortunately, I go back to what I said earlier. There is too much lobbying by vested interests not to do it. By those companies I said that are invested in Russia. A lot of the money, interestingly, about $170 billion is in Belgium. And the Belgian state is blocking this because one of the main it's stored in an entity called Euroclear, which is a global depository of financial assets. It's reluctant to sign over these assets to Ukraine. At the moment, Belgium itself is sitting on interest from these assets of about $7 billion and not doing anything with them. It could sign that interest on those assets over to Ukraine immediately. There's nothing particularly to stop that. So it's inertia. It's the computer says no attitude. Treasuries and central banks would rather just not do it. But actually, if this is a national security priority, we need to ask ourselves, as I said, firstly, why should Western taxpayers pay for Putin's damage when the money is in our banking systems? And what is the cost if we don't do it? And actually, the cost if we don't do it is Ukraine is not adequately funded. It loses the war. And then think of the consequences if Ukraine loses this war. The consequences are Russian tanks will continue west. They will threaten our security. We will have to increase defense spending. There's been a lot of focus on NATO's commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense. If Russia wins this war, that will have to increase probably to 3% plus, to where it was in the Cold War before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, 3% of GDP, what's that? Well, you can go back to the $40 trillion of Western GDP. Add 1 percentage point onto that, and that is about $400 billion of extra defense spending every year while Russia's threat remains. So, funding Ukraine to win the war is in our own interest. I should also argue that I should also point out that if Ukraine loses the war, we'll see tens of millions of Ukrainians move west. They don't want to live under Putin. You'll see a huge migration crisis in Europe, which will destabilize the European economy, create social and political problems, fan the rise of populism. And it's interesting going back to this idea that seizing frozen Russian assets is a threat to reserve currency status of the euro and the dollar. The biggest risk to the euro is Putin winning the war in Ukraine because of those problems about migration, increased defense spending, political and social instability in Europe. So we have to win this war. We have to do whatever it takes to win it. And funding Ukraine properly is key to that. And I think the only solution is using that $330 billion of Central Bank of Russia reserves in our jurisdictions.
And alongside doing that, are there other sanctions that the West could be implementing that would turn the screw on Putin?
Well, there's been a lot of focus on weak enforcement. Lots of countries, not in the Western alliance, but around Russia, have been helping Russia get around the sanctions. There's something called secondary sanctions. So basically, where you identify countries that are trying to benefit from sanctions by allowing Russia to break them, you sanction them. You send a clear message that, you may not want to join our sanctions regime. You don't want to be part of the Western alliance against Russia in this instance, but we don't want you to try and help Russia break the rules. So, countries in the Middle East, the Gulf, Turkey, Central Asia, we could be more aggressive in how we police sanctions to tighten the grip. There's a lot of what's called dual use goods that are getting into Russia, maybe consumer durable microchips, whatever, that you can use in a washing machine, but you can use in a tank. So we just need to be cleverer, more aggressive in terms of how we police them, tighten the screws on Russia. Because look, initially sanctions were imposed because of the annexation of Crimea and then Russia's annexation Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion. I think it's pretty clear now that Russia is a a long-term threat to us. Putin hates Western liberal market democracy. He hates the way we work, the way we're governed. He wants to destroy that. He's at war with us. He's made it clear that he's at war with us. That's been the messaging from him and Russian state TV. So, we need to make sure that Russia cannot regenerate its military machine that's been destroyed in Ukraine. And so sanctions have to remain for a long time, a bit like North Korea. We need to weaken him longer term. So we need to be cleverer, more aggressive. We could do more within the existing sanctions regime. There is also a really interesting idea that's been put around by someone called Nigel Davis of a think tank, former ambassador to Belarus. He argues that, in the end, we need to send a really clear signal to Western business that you shouldn't really be doing any business with Russia, right? And he argues, and I actually agree with him, that we should set a date at some point in the future, maybe 3 or 5 years away, and we say Western business should move to zero trade with Russia. The default setting should be we shouldn't trade at all with Russia, aside from getting special licenses for things that are really critical, right? So I'm not saying we actually go to zero, but we concentrate businesses' minds, and they have to explain exactly why it's really important to buy a particular product from Russia or sell a particular product to Russia. I don't see why, for example, Western consumer companies should be selling yogurts. I mean, what's the benefit of that, right? Or beer. Why are we trading at all with this regime that is now a fascist regime that has invaded another countries, committing war crimes and actually genocide against Ukraine? I mean, this is all, the Putin regime is increasingly looking like Nazi Germany. Like, why are we doing this, right? So I think we need to be more innovative, think outside the box a bit. Putin does. Putin, he outmaneuvers us all the time by doing things illegally or, we play by the rules. If you play by the rules against Putin, we lose, right? So we need to just be a lot cleverer.
And when we talk about sanctions, are there certain types of sanctions that are most effective? I mean, are they the ones that are specifically designed to damage the Russian economy, or actually are the ones that are most effective the ones that target the individuals around Vladimir Putin and undermine potentially their support for him? For example, I know at the start of the full-scale invasion, the UK and other Western nations went after the assets, froze the assets of, wives and girlfriends and daughters, for example, of people associated with the Putin regime, because there was this idea that would help put internal political pressure on Putin. Is there something in that?
Well, look, I mean, sanctions regimes last a long time. That's the reality. Look at Iran, North Korea, Cuba. Sanctions, countries learn how to get around them, evade them. They change how the economy works, from consumption to defense spending, all those kind of things. But sanctioned economies typically don't do very well, right? They don't grow at a high rate. They suffer from high inflation. They suffer capital flight, human flight. They become less effective, right? And that's, in the end, that's what we should be aspiring to with Russia, to make the Russian economy, the Russian military machine, less effective to regenerate that military capability. And I think, unfortunately, you need to apply an array of sanctions, to make this regime less popular internally, to create domestic, social and political pressures. Hopefully the population itself decide, we don't really like this, we want change. And I think the longer time goes on, things will become more difficult for the Russian economy, for the Russian people, the risk of social and political change becoming higher. I mean, only a year ago, remember the Prigozhin affair, this Wagner, this mercenary leader that was 2 hours away from getting his tanks into Moscow and getting rid of Putin. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that happened. And, it shows that it's still possible. Putin is not untouchable, right? He started this invasion. It's been a disaster, for Russia, I would argue. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers killed, injured, a huge amount of Russia's conventional military capability destroyed. He's not able to use the Black Sea fleet that was based in Crimea. He's not able to use it. Russia's military technological kind of arms machine that was sold to the world has been proven to be, the technology is pretty poor. People don't want to buy Russian weapons. That's a big loss to the Russian economy. He's lost the European gas markets, 50 billion euros a year. Europe has figured out how to survive without Russian gas. So there's many negatives that will have long-term impacts on the Russian economy. And I think eventually, the Russian population will get that and they'll decide they want something different. And we should be aspiring to that.
Let's come on to the economy of Ukraine. Obviously, at the start of the conflict, there was massive disruption, particularly in terms of, grain exports in the Black Sea and all that kind of thing. But as you rightly described, Timothy, Ukraine's astounding success of, destroying or rendering useless much of the Black Sea fleet has been pretty remarkable. I think I'm right in saying it's estimated the Ukrainian economy grew by 4.8% in 2023. Where are we now with Ukraine's economic performance?
Well, you're right. It's extraordinary, really, that this country that was completely invaded, full-scale invasion, didn't collapse economically, right? The banking system continued to work, telecom, mobile phones work, the railways work better than the UK. Although everywhere in the world seems to have a railway system that works better than the UK, so that's not necessarily saying anything that will surprise listeners. But, it's function, and I think that reflects a number of facts. And it reflects the fact that there were some reforms undertaken in Ukraine from 2015 after the Euromaidan. The banking system was cleaned out. The central bank was transformed into a strong institution. You have some pretty good people, capable people running these key institutions. And actually, the other angle is that the West has provided significant financial support, about $40 billion a year of fiscal and balance of payments support. That's meant that the currency hasn't collapsed. There hasn't been hyperinflation. Actually, the Ukrainian economy is growing at a higher pace than Russia, and inflation is lower than in Russia. And the currency has been stable. The ruble actually has been depreciating. So the Ukrainian economy has performed pretty well. There are risks, though. I should say that stability on the macro front has helped the war. It means that Zelensky doesn't have to focus on fighting an economic crisis. He can focus on the military campaign. There are challenges, though. The Western funding for Ukraine, it's about $40 billion of budget support, about $60 billion a year of military support, this $100 billion overall package. It's at threat. Obviously, there's about $61 billion of US support for Ukraine stuck in the US Congress. The crazy Republican Party, as is now, is it's in disarray, it's struggling to back that. Trump is having a pretty bad impact on the way Congress functions and its ability to support Ukraine. In the end, if you look at the Western support package, around half of it is provided by the US. And if they step away from that, I think Ukraine would struggle to sustain this macro stability we've seen in the last 2 years. And again, as I said, without that macro stability, if you see the opposite, macro instability, devaluation, hyperinflation, it makes it even more difficult for the Ukrainians to fight the war. So we have to figure out how we fund Ukraine in a scenario where the US is pretty dysfunctional and potential of a Trump presidency, and Trump has been pretty clear he doesn't want to support Ukraine, right? So how do we fill this gap, left by the Americans walking away? And as I argued previously, the only solution is using frozen Russian assets. Make Russia pay for the war it's waging in Ukraine. And, I think it should be a political scandal, actually, that our governments are spending our money, our taxpayer money, is being used to fund the war in Ukraine and the reconstruction, while our governments are not willing to spend Russia's money sat in Western bank accounts. How is that possible? I just find it extraordinary. And you mentioned, William Hague has been supportive. David Cameron, one of the first things he did upon assuming the position of Foreign Secretary was to support this effort. The UK should be leading the charge within G7 to make sure this happened. I worry, actually, that UK Treasury, Hunt at the Treasury, they're finding excuses not to do it. And it has to be done. If this is not done, we don't fund Ukraine properly, we see macro instability and they lose the war. And as I said before, that means massively increased costs to all of us because of the threat from a a resurgent Russia.
Longer term, hopefully once Ukraine has won this war, there will still be an enormous economic rebuilding job required for the country. What do you think is in store there? Do we need a Marshall Plan for the Ukrainian economy? Do we need to look at debt relief? What long term does Ukraine need?
Well, estimates of the damage, the World Bank and the Kiev School of Economics have done some work. At the moment, it's running around $500 billion, so $500 billion of damage. And it's every day it gets bigger, right, as Russia inflicts more damage. So about $500 billion. Probably, it's very difficult to spend that in 1 year. I would imagine what is possible. Ukraine's about a $200 billion economy. It's feasible, probably, to spend about $50 billion on reconstruction. So that'll be over 10 years, something like that. So $50 billion a year over 10 years. If we see peace and Ukraine security is assured, I think Ukraine has a very good future. I think the 500 billion I mentioned, we could find from frozen Russian assets. Ukraine should be able to borrow in international capital markets. We can think of lots of different structures to help Ukraine fill that gap of $50 billion a year likely for reconstruction and recovery. And I think, the interesting thing is Ukraine now has the anchor of EU accession. One of the problems for Ukraine over the last 30 years, unlike Poland, the Baltic states, Hungary, Czech Republic, that have had remarkable and really successful recoveries from the communist period, was they were given the EU accession anchor. I mean, the thing about the EU accession story is, obviously Brexit, there were skeptics about the whole story, but actually EU accession provided a blueprint for reform for these countries. It was a checklist, what you needed to do, how you need to reform your judiciary, your regulatory environment, your banking systems, and countries just ticked the boxes, and it helped them, it simplified the process of reform, and it was successful. And a lot of international business, also when they thought that Poland or Czech Republic was going to join the European Union, they decided, well, these countries, they have cheap labor, good business environment. We want to invest. So a lot of money came in on the assumption that EU accession was going to happen. Ukraine never had that. The West never, or the European Union never gave it the green light to EU accession. It now has that. So I think that will help the reform process move forward. It will mean that international business will want to locate to Ukraine. And actually, one remarkable thing, and I've covered, I first went to Ukraine in 1987. I've covered the country as an economist for 30 years. The innovation I've seen from Ukraine has been remarkable. Think about drones. Their ability, Russia was a global superpower militarily with fourth, fifth generation military kit. Ukraine was like a third, fourth rate military power. And we could debate, why Ukraine hasn't won, why the counteroffensive failed, but to fight Russia to a standstill over 2 years, to stop the initial Russian invasion, was extraordinary. And it was successful because of this innovation that, Ukraine has a strong industrial base. They're clever people. They figured out, how to reprofile Western military kit to the best advantage. So I think that innovation that we've seen during the war will really help them in recovery. So when the war ends, if we assure Ukraine's security with the EU accession anchor, if we make sure we use frozen Russian assets to refinance the recovery, I think Ukrainian economy will grow at a really good pace. It has real economic development perspective. I think we should think about how we structure institutions around recovery. I think there's a need for a reconstruction agency. If you remember, on the fall of communism in 89, fall of the Soviet Union in 91, we created the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development specifically for this purpose. I think Ukraine needs something similar to manage all this money that's going to go into the country to help them articulate their reform ideas, all this kind of thing. I think one of the problems when I think of economic support for Ukraine is the lack of joined up thinking by G7 and Western countries. And then you could say the same about, in general, the assistance we're providing for Ukraine on the military front. Again, there's lack of leadership from the West, lack of coordination, lack of joined up thinking, lack of real understanding what's at stake here. We have to beat Putin. We have to beat Putin in this war. We have to make sure Ukraine is successful in recovery and reconstruction, because Ukraine will be the front line of our defense against Russia. A strong Ukrainian economy is key to that. It needs to be able to buy its own weapons to defend itself as a front line for defending us.
Timothy, it's been a fascinating conversation. Could talk to you for hours, but really appreciate it. I'm going to have to leave it there. But thank you for joining us today on Frontline.
My pleasure. Thank you.